It's such an honor to be here. When I was growing up in this area, there were 50 Korean families. So look at us now. It's awesome. So one of my most profound childhood memories are the nightmares that made my mother scream night after night. Now, my mother had significant dreams. When she was pregnant with each child, she would have a dream that foretold the sex of that child. So in the 4th month of pregnancy with her daughters, she was always standing in water, and she would pick up something gorgeous, like the perfect stone, or a beautiful shell, or a little silvery fish, which was for me, the perfect laundry stone even. And for my brother, she was in a desert and approached a very large tree. And out of that tree fell a snake on her shoulders. And so she knew she was having a boy. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious, right? So though her dreams were always significant, I never understood what their significance was for me until much later in life. My parents came here in 1948. This was a couple years after the Pacific War. And they only planned to stay here 2 years and then return to Korea, but the Korean War prevented them from ever returning. And they lived out the remainder of their lives in the Washington, D.C. area. So when they came here, my mother left behind her parents, my grandparents, and her brother, my uncle. They had 3 children in Korea, and they had 3 in America, and I was the last of the 6. So being the last meant I had the most freedom. Having the most freedom meant I was the most Americanized. Being the most Americanized meant that I was estranged from my very Korean mother, and estranged from the idea of being Korean. In 1963, my grandfather died. And I learned about his death because I saw my mother crying in the kitchen. And on the table were spread in front of her photographs of his burial, because that was the only way she would be able to see what had happened at the funeral. And they were black and white photos, very gritty, very grainy. And it was a very raw funeral, a burial. There was a hole in the very bare, raw earth. And men were lowering the box with ropes into this very raw hole. And I think it was the first time I thought of my mother. I thought of my father in that box. What if that were my father? And it was the first time I thought of my mother, probably something beyond her being my Korean mother. Later, I asked my dad, who could speak English, was everything okay? Was she going to be okay? And he said, yes, grandfather had a good burial, and he received his last wish, which was to be buried high on a mountain in a dry grave. It was soon after that that the nightmares began. My mother dreamt that she was approaching a box in the distance, and as she neared, my grandfather would sit up, and he'd be dripping wet. Water would pour from his hair, from his eyes, down his beard, and he would lift his arms plaintively, and water would pour from his sleeves. She would wake up screaming. This nightmare recurred so often and so fiercely that she didn't know what to do. So she wrote to her brother, my uncle, to ask him to check the grave. Well, back then it took maybe 8 days for airmail to be sent to Korea. So in 3 days, sooner than he could have possibly received her letter, she received a letter from him. And in it, my uncle described having the very same dream. He had gone to the gravesite, and there was nothing. There was no water around. There was nothing. So they couldn't do anything. She continued to have the dream. Sometimes it dissipated, but it continued. And then about 3 years later, my grandmother died, maybe 12, 13 at this time. Again, she couldn't go back to Korea because of the cost. So the day before her burial, my mother got a phone call in the middle of the night from her brother. And he said, "What should I do?" We started to dig into grandfather's grave where she would be buried, and we came upon mud. So she was like, "Oh, mana, you have to exhume him." And so my father was a minister, and so they made all the proper arrangements and decided that grandfather needed to be exhumed. So when the grave diggers kept digging down, it got wetter and muddier the farther they went. And finally, when they were able to lift the box out, it took 12 extra men because it was so heavy and so stuck in the mud. And they laid it out on planks, and they drilled holes in the bottom, and water arced out. He had been buried in an underground stream. After that, the nightmares stopped. So, though her dreams were significant, again, I didn't know what their significance was for me. But this story, even though I couldn't understand her Korean language well, her stories always resonated with me. And this story in particular was one that I tried to write down later in life. And as I wrote it, I began to see that I didn't understand its context. And in order to understand their context, I began to research Korean history. I researched the period that my parents had grown up entirely in, from 1910 to 1945, during the Japanese occupation. Yet during that period of Japanese occupation, they maintained their Korean identity somehow. And so I researched my grandparents' era, the fading dynasty, the fading Yi dynasty, those years. And through that research, the knowledge that I gained changed me. The author, James Baldwin, says in his essay, What It Means to Be an American, "We cannot escape our origins, however hard we try. Those origins which contain the key, could we but find it, to all that we later become." My mother's nightmare was that key for me. With that key, I began to research what it was that made her who she was. And having that knowledge gave me the strength to write their story in a historical novel. I began to understand what my forebears had left for me. Finally, I understood not only what it meant to be an American, but what it meant to be a Korean American. Thank you.